Manage ADDS domain controllers and FSMO roles. Learn about essential ADDS domain controllers, management and maintenance tasks, including their deployment, backup and recovery, and schema management. Find out about design considerations for optimal number, roles, and location of domain controllers. Learning objectives. After completing this module, you'll be able to deploy ADDS domain controllers, maintain ADDS domain controllers, describe the ADDS global catalog role and its placement considerations, describe ADDS operations master roles, their placement considerations, and their management tasks, describe ADDS schema and its management tasks. Prerequisites. To get the best learning experience from this module, you should have knowledge and experience of Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2016, core networking technologies, Active Directory domain services, ADDS. Scenario. Con Technology Solutions is an IT services company in Seattle with major offices located throughout the world. Most of its compute environment runs on premises on Windows Server. This includes virtualized workloads on Windows Server 2016 hosts. Con Technology Solutions IT staff are migrating contextsol.com on-premises servers to Windows Server 2025. As part of the migration, contextsol.com plans to expand into additional sites and use virtualization to help expedite bringing a new site online. The company is also generating larger volumes of data with plans for even more data in the future. Because of this, the company needs flexible storage options. Finally, contextsol.com plans to increase their use of virtualization to optimize their computing environment because many physical servers are underutilized. As a newly hired Windows Server administrator, you're responsible for managing and maintaining Active Directory domain services, ADDS operations, including domain controller deployments, and ADDS backup and recovery. You also need to identify and implement the optimal placement of such ADDS roles as operation masters or global catalog. In addition, you've been asked to implement custom schema extensions to accommodate deployment of a newly developed in-house application. Deploy ADDS domain controllers. Domain controllers authenticate all users and computers in a domain. Therefore, it's critical to ensure the optimal number and placement of domain controllers in any ADDS environment, especially in larger distributed environments such as the one that Contoso is transitioning to. Deploy ADDS domain controllers in an on-premises environment. The domain controller deployment process has two steps. First, you install the binaries necessary to implement the domain controller role. For this purpose, you can use Windows Admin Center or Server Manager. At the end of the initial installation process, you have installed the ADDS files, but not yet configured ADDS on the server. The second step is to configure ADDS role. The simplest way to perform this configuration is by using the Active Directory Domain Services Configuration Wizard. You start the wizard by selecting the ADDS link in Server Manager. As part of ADDS role configuration, you need to provide answers to the questions in the following table. Question. Comments. Are you installing a new forest, a new tree, or an additional domain controller for an existing domain? Answering this question determines what additional information you might need, such as the parent domain name. What is the domain name system, DNS name, for the ADDS domain? When you create the first domain controller for a domain, you must specify the fully qualified domain name, FQDN. When you add a domain controller to an existing domain or forest, you use the existing domain name. Which level will you choose for the forest functional level? The forest functional level determines the available forest features and the supported domain controller operating system, OS. This also sets the minimum domain functional level for the domains in the forest. Which level will you choose for the domain functional level? The domain functional level determines the domain features that will be available and the supported domain controller operating systems. Will the domain controller be a DNS server? You can install the DNS role as part of the domain controller deployment. Will the domain controller host the global catalog? This option is selected by default. Will the domain controller be a read-only domain controller, RODC? This option isn't available for the first domain controller in a forest. What will be the directory services restore mode, DSRM, password? This is necessary for restoring ADDS database objects from a backup. What is the NetBIOS name for the ADDS domain? When you create the first domain controller for a domain, you must specify the NetBIOS name for the domain. Where will the database, log files, and sysvol folders be created? By default, the database and log files folder is located at c.windows lntds. By default, the sysvol folder is located at c windows sysvol. Install a domain controller on a server core installation of Windows Server. A Windows Server computer that is running a server core installation doesn't have the Server Manager Graphical User Interface (GUI). Therefore, you must use alternative methods to install the files for the domain controller role and to install the domain controller role itself. You can use Windows Admin Center, Server Manager, Windows PowerShell, or Remote Server Administration Tools (ARSAT) installed on any supported version of Windows Server that has the Desktop Experience feature, or any supported Windows client such as Windows 10. Install a domain controller from Media. If you have a network connection between sites that is slow, unreliable, or costly, you might find it beneficial to add another domain controller at a remote location or branch office. In this scenario, to significantly reduce the amount of traffic moving over the wide area network, OneLink, you can create an ADDS backup, perhaps to a USB drive, and take this backup to the remote location. When you're at the remote location and run Server Manager to install ADDS, you can select the Install from Media option. Most of the copying occurs locally. In this scenario, the OneLink transfers only security-related traffic and ADDS changes following the backup. The OneLink also helps ensure that the new domain controller receives any changes made to the central ADDS after you created the Install from Media backup. Branch office considerations. When you deploy a domain controller in a branch office that can't guarantee physical security, you can use additional measures to reduce the impact of a security breach. One option is to deploy an RODC. The RODC contains a read-only copy of the ADDS database, and by default, it doesn't cache any user passwords. However, you can configure the RODC to cache the passwords for users in the branch office. If an RODC is compromised, the potential loss of information risk is lower than with a full read-write domain controller. Upgrade domain controllers from the previous version. The process for upgrading a domain controller is the same for any version of Windows Server, starting with Windows Server 2012 R2 through Windows Server 2025. You can upgrade to a Windows Server 2025 domain using either of the following methods. Upgrade the OS on existing domain controllers that are running Windows Server 2012 R2 or later. Add servers running Windows Server 2025 as domain controllers in a domain that already has domain controllers running earlier Windows Server versions. We recommend the latter method because when you finish, you have a clean installation of both the Windows Server 2025 OS and the ADDS database. Whenever you add a new domain controller, Windows Server automatically updates the domain DNS records so clients are able to locate and use this domain controller. Deploy ADDS domain controllers in Azure Virtual Machines, VMs. Azure provides infrastructure as a service, which is a cloud-based virtualization platform. When deploying ADDS on Azure IaaS, you're installing the domain controller on a VM. So all the rules that apply to virtualizing a domain controller apply to deploying ADDS in Azure. When you implement ADDS in Azure, consider the following. Network topology. To meet ADDS requirements, you must create an Azure virtual network and attach your VMs to it. If you intend to join an existing on-premises ADDS infrastructure, you can extend network connectivity to your on-premises environment. You can achieve this through hybrid connectivity methods, such as a virtual private network, VPN connection, or an Azure Express Route circuit, depending on the speed, reliability, and security that your organization requires. Site topology. As with a physical site, you should define and configure an ADDS site that corresponds to the IP address space of your Azure Virtual Network. IP addressing. All Azure VMs receive dynamic host configuration protocol DHCP addresses by default, but you can configure static addresses that will persist across restarts and shutdowns. DNS. Azure's built-in DNS does not meet the requirements of ADDS. such as Dynamic DNS and Service (SRV) resource records. To provide DNS functionality for an ADDS environment in Azure, you can use the Windows Server DNS Server role or other DNS solutions available in Azure, such as Azure Private DNS Zones. Disks. You have control of caching Azure VM disk configurations. When you install ADDS to an Azure VM, you should place the ntds.dit and sysvol files on one of its data disks and set the host cache preference setting of that disk to none.